What happens when the people you trust to save your life are the ones planning your death? How could over 60 travelers vanish without a trace, with all clues leading to the town's most charitable family? What secret was so horrifying that local authorities sealed the records and tried to erase it from history? They welcomed strangers with open arms and a poisoned meal. How long could their divine killing spree last? In the autumn of 1798, 17 people traveling west vanished without explanation along a 20-mile section of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. They left behind no clues to their fate, only their horses and scattered possessions that revealed nothing. What makes these events so deeply unsettling is not just the number of missing persons, but the deliberate suppression of the official investigation by local leaders. For more than 200 years, the truth about the Hardin family farm was concealed within sealed court records, until a county clerk's discovery in 1987 brought to light the most disturbing case of organized murder in the history of the early American frontier. The papers described a killing operation so systematic, so expertly hidden behind a mask of Christian kindness, that it continued for 8 years without anyone realizing what was happening. Before we go further into the story of the farm that became Kentucky's first true house of horrors, make sure you subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell. We are going to reveal secrets that influential families tried to erase from history forever. And tell us in the comments which state you are listening from. We really enjoy hearing from our community of mystery lovers. The discovery that would eventually uncover the crimes of the Hardin family started not with screams in the darkness, but with the simple, mundane task of organizing old files in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a place balanced between the order of civilization and the raw danger of the wilderness, where the dream of a better life pulled thousands of people along dangerous mountain trails. The Wilderness Road, cut through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 20 years earlier, was the main route for settlers moving west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This narrow, twisting trail stretched for over 200 miles through some of the most hostile landscape in North America, where one wrong step could mean death from the elements, wild animals, or the many human predators who waited along the frontier. Along this dangerous path, dozens of small settlements had grown quickly, each one a symbol of hope for families looking for a new start in the untamed land. These communities were vital rest stops where tired travelers could recover, gather supplies, and learn about the dangers that lay ahead. The survival of these towns often depended on their ability to offer safe harbor for the endless flow of migrants passing through their borders. The settlement of Millfield was located at an important curve in the road, where the path came down from the rocky high ground into the rich valley of Beaver Creek. With only around 300 people, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's affairs, or believed they did. The town had been founded in 1794 by a group of Baptists from Virginia looking for religious freedom, and their values were visible in every part of daily life. Sunday church services were required for all residents, and the town council enforced strict moral rules that controlled everything from alcohol consumption to dancing. The community centered around Hendrick's General Store, a worn log building that functioned as both a place to trade goods and an informal courthouse. Jeremiah Hendricks, a rough former militiaman who had fought alongside Daniel Boone against native tribes, ran the business with absolute authority and a sharp sense for profit. His store sold anything a traveler might require: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the most recent news from the civilized world east of the mountains. Close by stood the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story structure that was the finest lodging available on the frontier. Martha Crane, The widow who owned the inn had come from Philadelphia 5 years before with enough funds to build the best accommodations between Lexington and the Virginia border. Travelers could get a hot meal and a clean bed for 2 bits a night, along with a kind of polite conversation that reminded them of the homes they had left behind. The town's spiritual heart was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a simple log building that could fit the entire population for Sunday services. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a minister educated at Harvard who had left a comfortable position in Boston for frontier missionary work, gave sermons that mixed standard religious teachings with practical advice for surviving in a harsh land. His presence gave Millfield a feeling of respectability that attracted settlers who might otherwise have continued on without stopping. Among the most admired residents of Millfield were the Hardens, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had arrived in the spring of 1791, saying they were survivors of brutal Native American raids that had destroyed their former home in eastern Virginia. They quickly became central figures in the small community, with Ezekiel working as a lay preacher who helped Reverend Cole, and Temperance organizing charity for struggling families who arrived with almost nothing. Ezekiel Harden was a man who earned respect through the sheer power of his personality. Standing over 6 feet tall with the wide shoulders of a man used to hard work, he had a physical presence that made other men move aside when he entered a room. His deep voice could fill the church without any effort, delivering sermons that brought listeners to tears with their emotional descriptions of God's love and serious warnings about eternal punishment. People who heard him speak often commented that he seemed to talk with the authority of someone who had personally seen both heaven and hell. Temperance Harden was equally remarkable in her own way. A petite, fine-featured woman with hair that had turned gray early and hands that were never still, she had become the community's unofficial doctor. Her understanding of medicinal plants was vast, and she could handle everything from broken bones to complicated childbirths with an ability that seemed almost magical. More than one family owed their lives to her late-night visits in times of emergency, and her fame for medical wonders had spread across the county. Their children seemed to be perfect examples of frontier goodness. Caleb, the older son, at 26, had his father's strong build and his mother's gentle manner. He worked the family farm without rest while also helping older neighbors with their own harvests. Josiah, 24, was slighter in frame but more thoughtful, often acting as the community's unofficial teacher during the winter months when farm work was slow. At 22, Mercy was regarded as one of the prettiest young women in the county, with a kind nature that made her well liked by everyone. The Hardin farm covered 400 acres of excellent flat land along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The property had cost Ezekiel almost all the money he had, but the investment had been a smart one. The fertile soil grew large crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek gave water for animals and power for a small grist mill that served the local area. Visitors often noted the farm's unusual success, observing that the Hardins appeared to have more wealth than could be accounted for by farming alone. Ezekiel had constructed his homestead with careful attention to both comfort and defense. The main house was a 2-story log building with stone chimneys and glass windows, an almost unbelievable luxury on the frontier. The rooms were furnished with items that seemed much too elegant for a simple farming family: carved chairs, imported dishes, silver candlesticks, and books that suggested learning and good taste. A huge barn could hold 50 horses, while a collection of outbuildings included a smokehouse, a dairy, a blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel called the largest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardins especially valuable to the community was their readiness to help travelers in trouble. The frontier showed no mercy to those who journeyed alone or without proper preparation, and hardly a week went by without someone arriving at the farm asking for aid. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out in dangerous conditions to help with a broken wagon or an injured horse, often inviting stranded families to stay at his farm until things could be fixed. Such generosity was seen as a Christian obligation on the frontier, but the Hardens practiced it to an amazing degree. Temperance was particularly known for her willingness to care for hurt or ill travelers regardless of whether they could pay. Her medical knowledge had saved many lives, and numerous families were able to continue their journeys only because of her help. She kept a well-supplied medical room in one of the outbuildings, complete with surgical tools and medicines that most frontier doctors could only wish for. The family's reputation for hospitality had become so strong that by 1798, it was normal for travelers to specifically look for the Hardin farm when planning their trips. Local guides regularly directed groups toward Beaver Creek, assuring them that the Hardins would offer fair prices for supplies and safe lodging for the night. The family's guest register, which Mercy kept with meticulous care, recorded hundreds of visitors over the years, traders, preachers, families, and lone adventurers who had found shelter at the successful farm. But in the brutal truth of frontier existence, where death hid behind every tree and trust could be fatal, appearances could be more than misleading, they could be murderous. The first indication that something was horribly wrong came on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher did not reach Lexington as planned. Fletcher was not an ordinary traveler. He was one of the most skilled and dependable merchants on the Wilderness Road, a man whose reliability had made him rich in a world where timing could decide between profit and ruinous loss. For 12 years, he had made the hazardous trip between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times each year, carrying finished goods west and raw materials east. Fletcher's business partner, Thomas Greeley, had worked with the merchant long enough to know his routines completely. Fletcher never changed his planned itinerary without sending a message, and he never took foolish chances that might endanger his valuable shipments. When Greeley had no word after 5 days, 2 days past Fletcher's expected arrival, he knew something terrible had happened. Greeley's search started at sunrise on October 18th. Tracing Fletcher's known route backward from Lexington, he asked innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the way, each of whom confirmed that Fletcher had come through on schedule. The path remained clear until Greeley reached the area around Millfield, where Fletcher appeared to have simply ceased to exist. The finding of Fletcher's horse came at midday on the second day of looking. The unique bay mare was found eating grass freely near Miller's Creek, still wearing its saddle, but showing no injury or alarm. The animal looked well fed and cared for, as if it had been purposely set free rather than left in a hurry. Most confusing of all, the horse's bridle had been taken off and hung neatly on a nearby tree branch, an action that hinted at human involvement rather than an accident. Fletcher's saddlebags were still in place, holding his trading items and a leather pouch with almost $50 in silver coins, a small fortune that represented months of risky work, the money being their eliminated simple theft, the most common reason for frontier disappearances. Even more alarming, Fletcher's personal items were spread in an intentional line leading away from the road into the deep woods, as if he had been made to drop them one by one while being pulled from his horse. The local constable, Jacob Winters, was a man especially suited to look into such mysteries. A former sergeant in the Continental Army who had served under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns, Winters had both the detective skills and the courage that frontier law enforcement demanded. He had witnessed enough death and deceit to know that the most apparent explanations were often incorrect, and Fletcher's disappearance felt to him anything but normal. Winters put together a search party within hours of Greeley's report, gathering 12 of Millfield's most capable men for what he knew would be a challenging and possibly hazardous investigation. The searches included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose ability to follow trails was as good as any local Native Americans, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every possible hiding spot within 50 miles of town. What the search party found went against all logical understanding. Fletcher's trail led unmistakably toward the Hardin farm, marked by pieces of torn cloth caught on thorns and occasional drops of what looked like blood. The signs indicated that the merchant had been alive, but hurt when he left the road, perhaps fighting against captors who were taking him further into the wild. But exactly at the edge of the Hardin property, every mark of Fletcher's movement simply disappeared. The searchers spent hours inspecting the area where the trail ended, searching for any clue that might explain Fletcher's fate. They found nothing. No dug-up soil, no concealed blood, no proof of a fight. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the earth by unseen hands and taken away into nothingness. Even Henrik Johansson, whose tracking skills were famous, admitted failure when faced with such a total lack of evidence. When Winters asked Ezekiel Hardin about the missing merchant, the family leader's reply was both helpful and oddly prepared. Yes, Fletcher had visited the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset and asking for directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel had warned him against taking unknown paths, especially with valuable items and winter weather coming. But Fletcher had been determined to try the route. The merchant had been courteous, but in a hurry, refusing Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a comfortable bed in order to continue while there was still light. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had seemed anxious and preoccupied, frequently checking his saddlebags and looking behind him, as if he thought someone was following him. When asked about this behavior, Fletcher had mentioned seeing unfamiliar men tracking him since leaving Virginia, but had ignored Ezekiel's suggestion that he stay at the farm until a larger group could take him to safety. The last the family had seen of him, Fletcher was riding north toward the Ridge country, intent on finding his shortcut despite the approaching darkness and bad weather. Ezekiel's story was supported in exact detail by every member of his family, each person giving the same descriptions of Fletcher's visit. They remembered his hurry, his rejection of their warnings, even his specific words when turning down their hospitality. Temperance remembered that the merchant had mentioned stomach troubles and had taken a small bottle of her herbal remedy before leaving. Caleb had offered to guide Fletcher to the Ridge Trail, but the merchant had said no, claiming his business was too urgent for any delay. Their consistency should have been comforting to Constable Winters. Instead, it struck him as unnaturally flawless, like a tale that had been carefully practiced until every element was memorized. Real witnesses, in Winters' experience, always disagreed on small points while agreeing on the important ones. The Hardin's account was too smooth, too thorough, too free of the minor contradictions that indicated honest recollection. The constable's doubts grew when he saw noticeable changes in the farm's arrangement since his last visit a few months before. A new smokehouse had been constructed near the main barn, unusually big for a family business, and built with thick stone walls that seemed intended for more than just preserving food. Fresh dirt surrounded several outbuildings, as if major digging work had recently happened. Most strange of all, the family's root cellar looked to have been significantly expanded, with new wooden supports visible around an entrance that now appeared big enough for a wagon. When Winters inquired about these changes, Ezekiel explained that the family had had an especially good harvest and had chosen to invest in better facilities for keeping and preparing their crops. The larger root cellar was needed for the increased amount of vegetables and preserved foods they intended to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would let them cure meat for both their own use and for sale. The explanations were sensible and well delivered, but something in Ezekiel's tone suggested he was picking his words with unusual caution. Most troubling of all, the family's normal friendliness seemed strained during Winter's visit. Their famous hospitality carried a feeling of nervous energy that the constable could not disregard. Temperance's hands trembled slightly as she served coffee, and Mercy kept looking toward her father, as if waiting for permission for each word she spoke. Even Caleb and Josiah, usually self-assured and friendly young men, seemed quiet and observant in ways that indicated they were concealing something important. But without solid proof of a crime, there was almost nothing Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially listed as a probable robbery or Native American attack. His name was added to the growing record of frontier deaths that marked the cost of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at auction to pay his remaining debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher lived only in the memories of those who had known him. Yet Fletcher's vanishing would turn out to be only the start of a pattern that would frighten the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, changing a successful farming community into a place where travelers spoke warnings and parents kept their children indoors after dark. Throughout the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the disappearances kept happening with a frightening regularity that defied all logical understanding. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would vanish without explanation along the same section of road, creating an area of fear that extended for nearly 20 miles in every direction from Millfield. The victims differed greatly in age, wealth, and traveling situation. Lone merchants like Fletcher, small family groups, even well-armed parties traveling together for safety. What connected them was their total disappearance, and the fact that each had been seen going toward or asking for directions to the Hardin farm before vanishing into the wilderness. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November during his trip from Richmond to start a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old doctor had been carrying his life's work in the form of medical tools, books, and supplies worth over $300, an investment that represented years of saving and planning. His wagon was found tipped over near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Hardin farm, with the contents spread around, but seemingly undisturbed. Local officials assumed that Cromwell had been thrown from his seat in an accident and had wandered into the wild in a confused state, eventually dying from the cold. The explanation seemed believable until searches found that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreck. The leather case held surgical tools of exceptional quality, including a bone saw and amputation kit that would be extremely useful to anyone trying to practice frontier medicine. No wild animal would have taken such things, and common thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that were still scattered around the crash site. The Henley family vanished in December during one of the worst snowstorms in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children had been looking for shelter when their wagon got stuck in a snowdrift only half a mile from the Hardin farm. According to Ezekiel's later account, the family had never reached his land despite the short distance, probably getting lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wild. Their bodies were never found, despite thorough searches when the weather improved. What made the Henley case especially disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled from the snowdrift and left beside the road, cleared of snow, and apparently searched completely. The family's clothes and personal items were gone, but their food supplies and tools were left untouched. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon indicated that several people had worked together to free it from the snow, an action that would have taken much time and effort in dangerous conditions. January brought the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a traveling preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfurt. Cross was known across the region for his powerful sermons and his fearless journeys through even the most hazardous parts of the frontier. The 50-year-old minister had survived Native American attacks, robbers, and countless natural dangers during 15 years of preaching, making his vanishing especially shocking to communities that had come to see him as unbreakable. Cross's horse was found 3 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that held almost $200 in church donations. The money being there eliminated theft as a motive, but raised alarming questions about what kind of threat could have defeated such an experienced and capable man. Local officials eventually decided that Cross had suffered a heart attack or stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the huge wilderness surrounding the Wilderness Road. Each disappearance followed the same baffling pattern. Abandoned horses found eating freely or tied to trees, scattered personal belongings hinting at sudden violence or struggle, and trails that led inevitably toward hardened land before disappearing completely. Yet, whenever questioned by increasingly doubtful authorities, the Hardin family gave believable explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about various dangers, bad weather, rough land, reports of criminal activity, but had chosen to continue their journey despite the family's worried advice. In several instances, the Hardins had offered food, shelter, or guide services that had been politely refused by travelers who seemed committed to keeping their schedules no matter the risk. Constable Winters found himself caught in a hopeless situation that became more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Hardins were among the most admired families in the county, their reputation for charity and Christian goodness unquestioned by everyone except him. Ezekiel's sermons kept drawing crowds from nearby towns, his passionate delivery and Bible knowledge impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Cole. Temperance's medical skills had saved many lives during the previous summer's fever outbreak, earning her a reputation that approached sainthood among thankful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without absolute proof would ruin his career and lead to social exile. Winters had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they could not support. They found themselves without friends, without jobs, and sometimes facing charges themselves. The frontier functioned on a complicated network of personal connections and mutual responsibilities, and targeting the wrong family could ruin a man's life more effectively than any court case. Furthermore, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were completely believable within the reality of frontier life. The Wilderness Road was genuinely hazardous, full of robbers, hostile Native Americans, extreme weather, and the many natural dangers that regularly took lives. Dozens of travelers vanished each year under circumstances much less mysterious than those surrounding the Hardin farm. What made this group of vanishings different was purely statistical. Too many people, too close together, all last seen in the same general area. But statistics meant little in a world where evidence was everything, and evidence seemed to disappear like morning fog whenever investigators came near the Hardin property. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and land, answered questions with apparent honesty, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so total and eager that it felt almost like ridicule to the increasingly frustrated constable. The first break in the family's carefully maintained appearance came from a surprising source. 9-year-old Timothy Varon, whose family lived on a small farm 2 miles east of the Hardin farm. Timothy was known throughout the community as a creative child who loved to explore the woods around his family's land, often coming home with detailed stories about the wildlife and natural wonders he had found during his adventures. In March 1799, young Timothy went to Constable Winters with a story that at first seemed like another product of a child's imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Beaver Creek when he heard screaming from the direction of the Hardin farm. But these were not the kind of screams that came from accidents, arguments, or even childbirth. They were continuous, hopeless cries of someone in ultimate fear, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both physical suffering and mental agony. According to Timothy, he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night, when good people should be sleeping. The screaming would continue for what felt like hours, sometimes joined by other noises the boy could not identify, rhythmic hammering, the creak of pulleys or ropes, and sometimes what sounded like several voices chanting together. The sounds always stopped suddenly, followed by a silence so absolute that Timothy wondered if he had dreamed the whole event. When Winters questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange noises themselves, but had dismissed them as natural occurrences common to frontier life, animal calls distorted by wind and distance, perhaps, or the sounds of night hunters in the wild. After all, the Hardins were good Christian people who had never given anyone reason to doubt them. What possible reason could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable home? Timothy's account might have been dismissed as a child's fantasy or misunderstood natural sounds, except for one detail that made Constable Winters stop and think. When pressed for specifics, the boy could correctly describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each one matched exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The connection was too exact to be accidental, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with Timothy Varon's disturbing story, Constable Winters started to build a case against the Hardin family with the careful patience of a man who understood that accusations against such important citizens would require completely undeniable proof. He began by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the farm, asking carefully phrased questions that would not reveal his growing suspicions or warn the Hardins about his investigation. What emerged from these discreet conversations was a troubling pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained events that had been ignored, dismissed, or explained away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was minor on its own, but together they created a picture that chilled Winters' blood. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm was nearest to the Hardin property, remembered several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead, lanterns moving between buildings at times when good people should be sleeping, the sounds of digging and heavy building that seemed to go on until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Temperance Hardin after church, the woman had given a reasonable explanation. The family was working on major improvements to their root cellar and other storage areas, and they preferred to do such work during the cool night hours rather than waste valuable daylight that could be used for tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but looking back, she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months longer than any normal building project would need. Furthermore, she had never seen proof of the huge amounts of dug-up soil that such extensive digging should have created. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, and sometimes what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm bordered the Harden property to the north, reported findings that were even more concerning. The Swedish immigrant, whose tracking and hunting skills were famous throughout the county, had found animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Not the normal remains of butchered farm animals, but bones that had been split, gnawed, and handled in ways that suggested something much more sinister than ordinary farming practices. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller pieces that Johansson could not identify despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed signs of being intentionally broken with tools, while others had saw marks that indicated systematic cutting apart, rather than natural decay or animal activity. When Johansson had approached Ezekiel about the mysterious bone piles, the family leader had given a believable, but somehow unsatisfactory explanation. Wild animals had been especially problematic that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to get rid of several sick animal bodies by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and weather breaking down these discarded bodies over time. But Johansson's trained, I had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically handled, and too widely spread to be the result of natural decay. Furthermore, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of sick animals. Most revealingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Harden family's behavior and attitude over the past year. The children, once friendly and social members of the community, had become quiet and secretive, avoiding group gatherings and speaking only when spoken to. Caleb and Josiah, who had previously been popular with people their age, now seemed anxious and distracted during public interactions, as if always worried about private matters. Mercy Harden's change was especially noticeable. The young woman, who had once been considered one of the most beautiful and lively girls in the county, now looked tired and older than her years, her face carrying a tormented expression that made people uneasy. She had completely stopped going to social events, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to pull away from human contact as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Ezekiel's sermons had taken on a darker feeling over the past months, focusing obsessively on themes of God's judgment, the punishment of sinners, and the need to remove evil from the world. Where his preaching had once stressed God's love and forgiveness, it now concentrated almost entirely on anger and revenge. Several church members had privately voiced concern about the increasingly violent pictures in his Bible interpretations. Constable Winters also found disturbing holes in the Harden family's background story that raised serious questions about their real identity and origins. While they claimed to be survivors of Native American raids in eastern Virginia, no one had been able to confirm their previous home or verify the specific attacks that had supposedly forced them west. Winters' inquiries to authorities in Virginia had produced no records of any Harden family being affected by Native violence in the time period they claimed. Furthermore, the family's arrival in Kentucky seemed to mark the start of their documented existence, as if the Hardens had appeared from nowhere in the spring of 1791. They had no letters from relatives, no business records from their former life, no personal items that existed before their appearance in Millfield. For a family claiming to have lost everything to native raids, they had managed to arrive in Kentucky with significant money and an impressive collection of household goods. The constable's investigation got an unexpected and alarming boost in April 1799, when a traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster came to Millfield with information that turned suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was a well-known figure throughout the frontier, a man whose work required him to travel constantly between settlements and who had a vast knowledge of events and people throughout the region. Brewster had spent the previous winter in eastern Tennessee, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had troubled the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. According to local accounts, at least 15 travelers had vanished along a remote section of road near a successful farm run by a family named Harper, Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 grown children. The similarities between the Tennessee disappearances and the current Kentucky cases were so striking that they could not possibly be accidental. The pattern was identical. Travelers would be seen going toward the Harper property and would simply disappear, leaving behind only scattered belongings and abandoned horses. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove their involvement, hindered by the same lack of physical evidence that was frustrating Winter's current investigation. Even more chilling were Brewster's descriptions of the Harper family themselves. Zachariah was a lay preacher known for his powerful sermons and good works, while Prudence was respected throughout the region for her exceptional healing skills. They had arrived in the valley claiming to be survivors of Native American raids with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as pillars of their community. When Brewster described the physical appearance of the Harper family, Winters felt his blood turn cold. Zachariah Harper had been a tall, commanding man with prematurely gray hair and intense eyes. Prudence was small and delicate with skilled hands and a wide knowledge of medicinal plants. Their children matched the ages and descriptions of Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Hardin so closely that they could have been the same people. Most damning of all, the Harper family had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, leaving their farm and disappearing without explanation. Just as suspicion about the disappearances was starting to focus on their property, neighbors had found the homestead empty with signs of hurried departure and intentional destruction. Buildings had been partly burned, wells had been filled with rocks and debris, and the whole farm showed evidence of systematic removal of anything that might give clues to the family's real identity or activities. When Tennessee authorities had finally gotten warrants to search the abandoned Harper property, they had made discoveries that still troubled the investigators who took part. Hidden throughout the woods surrounding the farm were dozens of shallow graves holding the remains of both animals and humans. The human remains included personal items belonging to several of the missing travelers, creating undeniable proof that the Harper family had been responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had vanished completely, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of their true identities. A 6-month search had failed to find any trace of the Harper family, and the case had eventually been closed with the assumption that they had either died in the wilderness or escaped to territories beyond the reach of American law. The implications of Brewster's revelations were staggering and terrifying. If his account was accurate, the Hardin family were not just local criminals who had committed a few chance murders. They were experienced serial killers who had perfected their methods over years of practice, moving from area to area when suspicion grew too strong and leaving behind a path of bodies that stretched across multiple states. Even worse, Their current operation in Kentucky appeared to be much more advanced and successful than their earlier activities in Tennessee. They had learned from their errors, developed better ways of disposing of evidence, and created a more believable cover identity that had let them work undetected for 8 years. The number of victims in Kentucky likely far exceeded those in Tennessee, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The weight of Isaac Brewster's testimony pressed down on Constable Winters like a physical load. But he knew that convincing as the evidence might be, it would not be enough to get convictions against the Hardin family in a court of law. Frontier justice moved slowly, and judges demanded absolute physical evidence before approving arrests that could destroy innocent lives and tear apart established communities. The constable needed proof that would hold up under the examination of doubtful lawyers and suspicious juries, evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he badly needed came from the last source he would have expected: Mercy Hardin herself. On the night of May 22, 1799, the 22-year-old woman appeared at Winter's cabin like a ghost coming from the darkness, her face marked with tears and her hands shaking with barely controlled fear. What she told him during the next 3 hours would finally reveal the full horror of what had been happening at the Hardin farm and provide the evidence needed to bring Kentucky's most notorious family of killers to justice. According to Mercy's devastating confession, her family had been systematically murdering travelers for more than 8 years, starting just months after their arrival in Kentucky. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scale of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ceremonial way in which the murders had been planned and carried out. The killing operation, as Mercy described it, was much more advanced than Winters had thought possible. Her father Ezekiel had persuaded the family that they were doing God's work by removing what he called unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders were not random acts of violence motivated by greed or chance, but carefully planned executions that served both what Ezekiel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly complex material needs. The process began with what the family called evaluation. When promising targets approached the farm, travelers with valuable goods, large amounts of money, or skills that the family wanted, Ezekiel would talk to them in seemingly harmless conversation meant to judge their moral character. He would ask about their reasons for traveling, their families, their business dealings, and their religious beliefs, all while acting like a concerned Christian neighbor worried about their safety. Based on these talks, Ezekiel would decide whether each traveler deserved what he called judgment. The wealthy were automatically guilty of greed and love of possessions. Educated people were condemned for pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with small children were accused of carelessly risking innocent lives. Even ministers and missionaries could be found guilty of false holiness or religious mistakes that marked them as heretics deserving death. Once Ezekiel had given his secret decision, the family would move into action with the accuracy of a military operation. They would ask the condemned travelers to stay the night, mentioning concerns for their safety on dangerous roads or offering help with repairs to wagons or equipment. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to refuse, especially during bad weather or when travelers were truly in need of assistance. The doomed visitors would be welcomed into the main house and given what seemed to be genuine frontier hospitality. Temperance would make elaborate meals showing her cooking skills, while the children would entertain guests with music, conversation, and displays of their education and refinement. The evening would end with family prayers led by Ezekiel, whose powerful voice and Bible knowledge impressed even skeptical visitors. but the final part of every meal contained a carefully prepared mixture of herbs that Temperance had perfected over years of testing. The drug combination was almost undetectable when mixed with strong coffee or whiskey, creating effects that copied natural tiredness after a long day of travel. Victims would slowly become sleepy and confused, accepting the family's suggestion that they go to bed early to regain their strength for the next day's journey. The drugged travelers would wake up to find themselves tied and helpless in the farm's underground rooms, a complex network of chambers and tunnels that had been dug far beyond what any normal root cellar would need. According to Mercy's terrified description, the underground complex stretched for nearly 200 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Ezekiel called his courtroom, a horrible imitation of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron chains set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been twisted into tools of terror. Here, Ezekiel would lead formal trials that decided each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were decided before the proceedings even began. But the trials were not just cruel theater. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology, by framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes. Ezekiel had created a belief system that let his family commit atrocities while keeping their self-image as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious obligation, each victim a sacrifice offered to clean the frontier of unworthy souls. The punishments given in Ezekiel's underground courtroom varied based on his judgment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills for the family's benefit before being killed. Dr. Cromwell, the doctor who had disappeared in November, had been made to train Temperance in advanced surgical methods before his death. Reverend Cross had been forced to write sermons that Ezekiel later delivered as his own, improving his reputation as a Bible scholar. Others faced immediate execution, usually by methods that Ezekiel claimed were approved by the Bible. Hanging was kept for thieves and robbers, while drowning in the underground water system was the fate of those guilty of pride or blasphemy. The most elaborate executions were saved for those whom Ezekiel judged to be the most evil, a group that included rich merchants, government agents, and anyone who had shown doubt about frontier religion. Just when we believed we had heard everything, the horror in Kentucky grows worse. If this story is chilling you, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Tap that like button to help our content, and remember to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Mercy's testimony revealed the systematic nature of the family's crimes in terrifying detail. Each member had been given specific parts in both the murders and the complex cover-up that followed. Caleb and Josiah acted as the muscle of the operation, responsible for capturing victims, maintaining the underground complex, and disposing of bodies through a limestone cave system that connected to the deepest parts of the dugout chambers. Their size and strength made them perfect for the physical demands of moving unconscious prisoners and heavy loads of dirt and stone. Mercy herself had been forced to serve as the family's record keeper, keeping detailed ledgers that recorded every victim's identity, possessions, and method of disposal. Her neat handwriting filled dozens of notebooks with information that read like a merchant's inventory, except that the goods being listed were human lives, and the transactions were murders. Each entry included the victim's name, age, appearance, estimated wealth, and personal belongings, along with notes about their final words and behavior during their imprisonment. Temperance's role was perhaps the most important to the operation's success. In addition to preparing the drugs that disabled victims, she served as the family's medical expert, keeping prisoners alive when their skills were needed, and making sure that executions happened without problems that might create evidence. Her knowledge of anatomy, gained through years of frontier medical practice, had been twisted into skill in torture and murder. Most chilling of all, Temperance had developed what she called treatments for prisoners who proved uncooperative or tried to escape. These punishments were designed to break the will without causing death, using techniques that combined her medical knowledge with psychological torture. Prisoners who refused to follow the family's demands would find themselves subjected to calculated amounts of pain and fear until they became completely obedient. The family's success in avoiding discovery had depended on more than just careful planning. It required a complex system of disposal and deception that removed all evidence of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the farm property itself, but were instead moved through the cave system to remote limestone caves that lay several miles from the homestead. These natural chambers provided ideal conditions for decomposition, while their distance from the farm made discovery almost impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Valuable items, money, jewelry, fine weapons, and tools were either kept by the family or sold in distant markets where they could not be connected to missing persons. Less valuable objects were carefully scattered along roads throughout the region, creating false trails that suggested robbery or Native American attacks. Even victims' clothing was handled systematically, with useful garments kept for the family's use, while distinctive items were destroyed to prevent identification. The Harsas presented a special challenge since they were both valuable and easily recognized by people familiar with the victims. The family had developed relationships with dishonest horse traders in distant counties who asked no questions about the animals' origins. By selling the Harsas far from where their owners had disappeared, the Hardens created additional false trails that further confused investigations. But perhaps the most clever part of their deception was the way they used their charitable activities to divert suspicion. Every act of kindness, every medical treatment provided by Temperance, every sermon delivered by Ezekiel served two purposes. They genuinely helped the community while creating a reputation that made the family almost above suspicion. Who would believe that people who saved lives during epidemics could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even developed backup plans for different types of investigations. If authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily stop their killing activities while increasing their charitable works to strengthen their reputation. They had found several escape routes that would let them leave the farm quickly if discovery seemed likely, just as they had done when leaving Tennessee years before. According to Mercy, the family had been planning to expand their operations significantly. They had found several other remote farms along the Wilderness Road where similar courts could be run, creating a network of killing sites that would let them work with even greater freedom. The final goal was to establish what Ezekiel called courts of divine justice throughout the frontier, removing unworthy travelers on a scale that would reshape the moral character of the whole region. But what finally drove Mercy to confession was not moral realization or sudden conscience. It was fear for her own life. She revealed that Ezekiel had become increasingly paranoid about possible discovery and had started to see anyone who might pose a threat as deserving of judgment. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions, Isaac Brewster, the peddler who had been making inquiries about the Tennessee disappearances, and even Constable Winters himself. More immediately terrifying, Mercy disclosed that another victim was currently being held in the underground chambers, a traveling surveyor named William Patterson, who had been captured 3 days earlier and was scheduled for trial the following night. But Patterson was not the only prisoner in the family's custody. Unknown to the outside world, they were also holding 2 other captives. A young woman named Rebecca Foster, who had been missing for over a week, and an elderly man identified as Luther Grimby, a traveling preacher who had disappeared the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held at the same time showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had increased their activities. What had started as chance murders of isolated travelers had developed into something close to an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed according to a detailed schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted purposes. Winters realized that time had run out for careful investigation and legal procedures. If Mercy's information was accurate, innocent people were going to die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Hardin family would be extremely dangerous. They were armed, ready for resistance, and operating from a strengthened position that they had spent years perfecting for exactly this kind of situation. Constable Winters faced the most difficult decision of his law enforcement career. Knowing that every choice carried deadly results, he could try to arrest the Hardin family by himself, risking not only his own life, but possibly alerting them to escape before their current victims could be saved. Alternatively, he could ride to Lexington for reinforcements, almost certainly sentencing Patterson, Foster, and Grimby to death, while giving the Hardins time to destroy evidence and flee to another territory where they could continue their killing spree. The choice became easier when Winters realized he would not have to act alone. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered immediately when approached for help. The immigrant's military experience in the Swedish army and his intimate knowledge of the local terrain made him an invaluable partner for what would essentially be a combat mission. Isaac Brewster also volunteered his services, driven by guilt over his failure to expose the Harper family's crimes in Tennessee years earlier. The peddler's knowledge of the family's previous methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in predicting their likely responses to attack. 2 other men from town, Benjamin Stokes, the former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of fighting against Native Americans, completed the quickly gathered rescue team. The plan they created was necessarily simple, but very dangerous. The group would approach the Hardin farm after midnight on May 23rd, using darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their main goal was rescuing the imprisoned victims, with capturing the killers being a secondary concern. If the Hardins could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force needed to prevent their escape. Mercy provided crucial intelligence about the farm's layout and the family's likely defensive positions. The underground complex had only 2 entrances: the main access through the enlarged root cellar and a hidden emergency exit that came out in the woods nearly a quarter-mile from the main house. The family kept weapons stored at both locations, and Ezekiel had trained his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape through the cave system. The approach to the farm required crossing nearly a mile of open ground that would leave the rescuers completely exposed if detected. Johansson's tracking skills proved invaluable in finding a route that used creek beds and tree lines to provide maximum concealment. The group moved with the silence of experienced hunters, each man understanding that discovery would likely mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they discovered when they reached the Hardin property went beyond their worst fears and confirmed that Mercy's testimony had actually understated the scope of her family's crimes. The farm showed clear evidence of recent digging work far beyond what any normal farming operation would require. Piles of earth and stone were spread throughout the property, while the smell of lime and decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The main house looked normal from the outside, with warm light shining in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys. But as the rescuers came closer, they could hear sounds that chilled their blood, muffled voices coming from under the ground, occasional screams that were quickly silenced, and the rhythmic sound of metal hitting stone that suggested ongoing construction work in the underground chambers. The rescue operation began at exactly 2 a.m., when the raiders believed the family would be least alert and most open to surprise attack. Winters and Johansson approached the main entrance to the underground complex, while Stokes and Crawford placed themselves to block the emergency exit. Brewster stayed with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The root cellar entrance turned out to be much more elaborate than Mercy had described. What looked from the surface like a simple storage facility was actually a sophisticated fortification with multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire. The Hardens had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of assault, creating killing zones that would let a small number of defenders hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown overconfident after years of successful operation, never imagining that their carefully maintained cover could be broken by local law enforcement. When Winters and Johansson went down into the underground complex, they found Ezekiel and his sons completely unprepared for resistance, focused instead on the gruesome business of preparing their current victims for execution. The rescue of the prisoners was both easier and more horrifying than the raiders had expected. They found William Patterson chained in a stone cell barely large enough for a man to stand up in, weak from days without proper food, but alive and aware. Rebecca Foster was in worse condition, showing signs of the treatments that Temperance had used to break her resistance. Luther Grimby was barely conscious, his health destroyed by weeks of captivity and psychological torture. But the prisoners were not the only people in the underground complex. As the raiders went deeper into the cave system, they discovered evidence of the family's crimes that defied human understanding. The limestone chambers contained a charnel house of human remains covering nearly a decade of systematic murder. Bones, clothing fragments, and personal items were spread throughout multiple rooms, creating an archaeological record of atrocity that would take weeks to fully catalog. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both scale and detail. In addition to the human remains, the raiders found the detailed records that Mercy had described, written in her careful handwriting and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The notebooks contained the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 67 victims spanning 8 years, far more than the investigation had uncovered and representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was found in what Ezekiel had called his courtroom. The underground chamber held not only the makeshift judge's bench and religious symbols that Mercy had described, but also a collection of personal trophies taken from victims. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, and other keepsakes were displayed like battle honors, creating a museum of murder that revealed the full extent of the family's sadistic pride in their crimes. The capture of the Harden family proved to be quick but violent, as Ezekiel and his sons tried to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The family leader showed no surprise at being discovered, instead starting a rambling sermon about divine judgment and the rightness of his mission. Even as gunfire echoed through the stone chambers, Caleb and Josiah fought with the desperate rage of men who knew they faced certain death if captured. Using their intimate knowledge of the cave system to launch attacks from hidden positions, the battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly an hour, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages that the defenders had prepared as killing zones. The end came when Temperance, trapped in the main house above, tried to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building and its contents. The flames spread quickly through the dry wood structure, threatening to collapse the main entrance to the underground complex and trap everyone below. Faced with a choice between burning alive and surrendering, the surviving Hardens finally put down their weapons. Only Mercy surrendered willingly, her confession having already condemned her family and decided their fate. She was found in her room kneeling in prayer, and apparently resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated not by moral awakening, but by fear that her father's paranoia would eventually mark her for execution, along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Hardin family's capture sent shock waves throughout Kentucky and the broader frontier region, forcing communities to face the terrifying reality that one of their most respected families had been systematically murdering travelers for nearly 10 years. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that local authorities struggled to process the full scope of the crimes. The investigation that followed the raid revealed details that went beyond even the raiders' worst expectations. The cave system beneath the Hardin farm was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 2 miles through natural limestone caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Multiple chambers had been dug out and strengthened, creating an underground complex that could hold dozens of prisoners at the same time. The physical evidence recovered from these chambers painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned not just the 8 years the family had lived in Kentucky, but potentially decades of similar crimes in other territories. In addition to the 67 victims documented in Mercy's careful records, searches found personal items and human remains that suggested the true number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered rather than just individual travelers. The Henley family, who had disappeared during the December snowstorm, were found to have been held in the underground complex for over a week before being executed. Their children, ages 6 and 8, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths before being killed and their bodies disposed of in the deepest parts of the cave system. The trial of the Hardin family began in late June 1799 and lasted for nearly a month, drawing spectators from across Kentucky and the surrounding territories. The courthouse in Lexington was packed daily with crowds that included victims' relatives, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in American criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge, Honorable Samuel Whitmore, ordered parts of the testimony sealed from public view. Ezekiel Hardin's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Rather than showing regret for his crimes or trying to minimize his family's responsibility, he used his testimony as a chance to deliver long sermons about divine justice and the rightness of his mission. He claimed that every murder had been approved by God as part of a holy war against sin and corruption on the frontier. According to Ezekiel's twisted theology, he and his family had been chosen as tools of divine judgment, given the task of removing unworthy souls who posed a threat to the moral order of Christian civilization. The money and goods taken from victims were not theft, but rightful payment for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex was not a prison, but a courthouse where God's justice was administered according to biblical principles. His wife and sons maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence, insisting they had been forced into participating by Ezekiel's religious fanaticism and threats of violence. Temperance claimed that her medical knowledge had been used against her will to keep prisoners alive, while Caleb and Josiah testified that their father had convinced them they were fighting a holy war against agents of Satan who threatened their community. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Mercy's detailed records included notes in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had helped document their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms included trophies taken from victims, suggesting that the killings provided psychological satisfaction rather than just material gain. Only Mercy Harden expressed genuine remorse for her part in the murders, though her testimony revealed that her cooperation with authorities had been motivated mainly by fear rather than moral awakening. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims whose remains had been found in the cave system. Her willingness to testify against her family members earned her some mercy from prosecutors, though she would still face severe punishment for her participation in the crimes. The sentences given by Judge Whitmore were quick and final, reflecting both the seriousness of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden were all sentenced to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 15, 1799. The date was chosen deliberately. It marked exactly 1 year since Samuel Fletcher's disappearance had first revealed the family's crimes and started the investigation that led to their capture. Mercy Harden received a sentence of life in prison, sparing her from execution in exchange for her cooperation with authorities and her youth at the time many of the crimes were committed. She would spend the remaining 43 years of her life in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, becoming one of the longest-serving prisoners in the institution's history. The executions drew the largest crowd in Kentucky's history to that point, with over 4,000 people traveling from throughout the region to witness the end of the frontier's most notorious family of killers. The event took on an almost carnival atmosphere, with sellers offering food and drink to spectators who had made long journeys to see justice served. Ezekiel maintained his religious fanaticism to the very end, using his final words to deliver a rambling sermon in which he cursed the community that had rejected his vision of divine justice. He predicted that God would punish Kentucky for executing his chosen servants, and that the frontier would be overrun by the very sinners his family had worked to remove. His wife and sons died in silence, their deaths bringing closure to one of the darkest chapters in early American criminal history. The Harden farm was burned to the ground immediately after the executions, with every building reduced to ash and rubble in a ceremony that took on ritual meaning for the traumatized community. The underground chambers were sealed with explosives and tons of rock, creating a tomb that would ensure the family's victims could finally rest in peace. Local authorities declared the land cursed and forbade any future building on the site. But the legacy of the Harden family's crimes extended far beyond their own deaths, establishing important precedents in frontier justice and fundamentally changing how communities viewed the balance between hospitality and security. The case led to new laws requiring background checks for land purchases and established procedures for investigating missing persons that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. More importantly, the Harden case served as a chilling warning about the dangers of blind trust in religious authority and the ease with which evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. Communities throughout the frontier began questioning their assumptions about neighbors and strangers alike, recognizing that surface appearances could conceal the darkest intentions. The legal proceedings also established important precedents for the use of indirect evidence in capital cases and the protection of witnesses who cooperated with authorities. Mercy Hardin's testimony demonstrated that family loyalty could be overcome by proper incentives and legal protections, paving the way for similar prosecutions in other complex criminal cases. The surviving records of the case were sealed by court order in 1801, with access restricted to law enforcement officials and legal scholars. This decision was made partly to protect the privacy of victims' families, but also to prevent the case from inspiring copycat crimes by other twisted individuals who might see the Hardin's methods as a blueprint for their own murderous ambitions. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth about the Hardin family remained hidden in those sealed documents, with only fragments of the story surviving in local folklore and family traditions. The few historians who were allowed access to the files were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from publishing their findings or sharing details with other researchers. Even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, transforming the story into vague tales of bad people who had once lived along Beaver Creek. The location of the farm itself became uncertain as property lines changed and new settlers arrived who knew nothing of the area's dark history. By the mid-1800s, only a few elderly residents could accurately point out where the Hardin homestead had stood. The rediscovery of the case files in 1987 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of Kentucky's first family of serial killers. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The cave system where the family disposed of their victims has never been fully explored, and authorities believe additional remains may still be hidden in the deepest passages that were too dangerous for 18th century investigators to reach. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. Local authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest undisturbed rather than risk new revelations that might traumatize descendants of the victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Hardin case has forced historians to reconsider other unexplained disappearances along frontier roads throughout the early American period. How many other respectable families might have been hiding similar secrets? How many missing travelers were victims not of random violence, natural hazards, or Native American attacks, but of carefully planned murders by people they trusted? Statistical analysis of frontier disappearances reveals troubling patterns that suggest the Hardin family may not have been unique. Groups of vanishings near other prosperous, charitable families have been identified in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia during the same time period. While none of these cases have been definitely linked to systematic murder, the similarities are striking enough to justify further investigation. The answers to these questions died with Ezekiel Hardin on that August morning in 1799, but the questions themselves serve as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most innocent face. The greatest horrors in human history have frequently been committed by those who believe they were doing God's work, and the frontier period of American expansion created countless opportunities for such twisted individuals to operate without punishment. The Hardin case also highlights the vulnerability of isolated communities that valued reputation over evidence and trust over vigilance. The family's success depended not just on their own criminal skills, but on their neighbors' willingness to dismiss uncomfortable evidence in favor of maintaining social harmony. The price of that willingness was measured in human lives. This mystery shows us that the frontier justice of early America was often more complex and disturbing than traditional histories have acknowledged. The expansion westward created not just opportunities for honest settlers seeking new lives, but also perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit the trust and desperation of vulnerable travelers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Hardin family's crimes? Or might there be even darker secrets still buried beneath the Kentucky soil? Could similar families have operated in other frontier regions without ever being discovered? Leave your comment below and share your theories about this case. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.